Hello and welcome to Unsupervised Thinking, a podcast on neuroscience, artificial intelligence, and science more broadly. We are a group of computational neuroscientists. I'm Grace.
I'm Jan.
I'm Alex.
And the topic for this episode is motor control, and this was a topic recommended to us by Harsha Gurnani. But I do want to point out that Alex is not in the room with us today, as she normally is when we record. Alex, do you want to tell people where you are and why?
Yeah, hi everyone. I'm in Paris, so I'm really happy to announce that I just recently started a faculty position at the Group for Neural Theory at École Normale Supérieure. So I'm joining by Skype today.
Woohoo!
Yeah.
This was a podcast started by a bunch of grad students, and we've now become kind of the enemy, you know?
Wait,
We've become the establishment.
I'm the enemy now?
I'm kidding. Right, so the topic is motor control, and for this we read one review about anatomy, which is called Descending Pathways in Motor Control, and that's by Roger Lemon, and that was an annual review of neuroscience article from 2008. And then we read one that's more about both biology and computational modeling, and that's called Hierarchical Motor Control in Mammals and Machines. And that's a 2019 review in Nature Communications, and the first author of that is Josh Merrill. And that's a familiar name. People may have noticed that our normal co-host Josh is not on the show right now. He is in the room.
Lurking in the back.
And yeah, he wrote this review on motor control, and we decided that he would kind of have to taste the medicine of this podcast since we read a bunch of other people's work and talk about it without them present to defend it. So Josh is listening in on us talk about his work, and then at the end of the conversation, we'll actually let him respond. If he can hold his tongue for long enough, he might just jump in the middle of it. But yeah, so we're trying this experiment out to see, I guess, how well we do discussing someone else's work, but also how it feels to have to listen to someone discuss your work as you sit in a cone of silence. So I guess we can get into it. So I guess the idea of motor control to some people, you know, I think they're called the motor chauvinists. They like to say that the whole point of the brain is to produce movement, which I guess in some very strict sense has to be true, but it might place too much emphasis on motor output as the only interesting thing that the brain does. I don't know how you guys feel about that. Do you agree?
That actually happened to me when I was a PhD student, that someone who was interested in motor control visited our lab, and everyone tried to say what they were doing, and he kept saying no, the only thing that the brain does is produce behavior. But now I get to be that person, so that's fine. Now I agree, because now I get to do it because I'm interested in motor control.
Yeah, I mean, I guess early on in your neuroscience career, you always hear that story about that, what is it, the octopus or something? No, it's not an octopus. It's a thing that eats its brain when it becomes...
Oh yeah, there's like a sponge or something like that.
Yeah, exactly, yeah.
It's like once it lands on a rock or coral where it's going to stay forever, it digests its own brain.
Yeah.
Because once you're not moving, you don't need a brain anymore.
Yeah. So the motor chauvinists love this example. And so you hear it
I
quite
never
often.
heard this example.
Really?
Yeah, I'm going to start using it. This is the first slide of every talk from now on.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, that's, as a naive grad student, I thought, oh my God, that's a good point.
Strong evidence.
There's still a lot of stuff that happens in between.
Yeah, so this anatomy review is talking about the descending pathways, which are kind of the outputs of the brain to control motor. And I guess, I don't know, my takeaway from reading it was that it seems like kind of a mess. Like, it's hard to create clean classifications of these different types of descending pathways. So the way that they group them is by where they target in the spinal cord. So you have some parts of the brainstem that go to both sides of the spinal cord. So like the standard story is like the left side of the brain controls the right side of the body or whatever. But you do have portions of in the brainstem where you project to both sides of the spinal cord, which makes sense because sometimes you have to coordinate across both sides of your body. They say this is for like posture. And then there's other parts that only go to the opposite side of the spinal cord to control like distal limb movement. So that's more in line with the normal story. They also talked about something about the emotional motor system. It comes from many places in the brainstem and uses neuromodulators to control things in the spinal cord. I don't know, it just seemed like there were a lot of different areas in the brain that even project directly to the spinal cord, so like cortex and brainstem and subcortical areas and stuff like that, and then areas from the cortex project to the brainstem or the subcortex that then project to the spinal cord. So it's like kind of redundant pathways, a lot of things going into the spinal cord. So they say in this article, like, the spinal cord functions as part of the brain, not as its servant. And I feel like, yeah, like the textbook explanation is, oh yeah, like the brain kind of decides on the motor plan and sends the instructions to the spinal cord. But when you have so many different sets of instructions converging on the same place in the spinal cord, then it's clear that like the spinal cord is in some way making a decision about what to do with all that information. It's not like just getting a clear signal from above about what to do. Another interesting thing was how these descending pathways can project to the sensory part of the spinal cord, because obviously the spinal cord, like, it's the output to the body, but it also gets all the inputs from the body. And you can actually have like motor signals that project to sensory neurons in the spinal cord to influence how sensory processing happens in light of movement.
I think just this year there was also a paper showing plasticity of corticospinal pathway. So just to kind of reinforce the idea that it's part of the brain and kind of doing something interesting and not just like a hardwired like readout, I guess.
Yeah. And this review is talking generally about how like when you lesion certain parts of the descending pathways, either like brainstem or whatever, like there's pretty fast plasticity as well in some parts of them. So it's like immediately kind of picking up the slack of what's no longer there. In a way that kind of makes it hard to study, because if you want to say, oh, if you lesion this area, that means the animal can't do X or Y. If, like, after a day it can again, like, how do you take that? Does that mean that that pathway was normally involved in that behavior, or, like, it was only a small influence because they could get over it very quickly when it's gone, or,
Yeah, so I guess this seems like it's probably an understudied area in theoretical neuroscience anyway, and probably... I saw a project recently, I forget where it came from, but they're trying to like map out basically the connections between the central nervous system and the peripheral nerves more accurately, so they can actually find out what's happening.
But you're saying like in computational neuroscience, people don't pay much attention to the peripheral nerves? Or?
I think so. I mean, people do like biophysics, basically, right? How the signal conducts down and stuff, but there's and maybe a bit of like how the patterns are generated. So that's
central
a big
pattern generation, like oscillations and stuff.
Yeah.
People like to make little model circuits of how like a few neurons can create a pattern that could be used for walking or whatever.
Yeah. So but how it connects to like the central nervous system, or the brain rather.
Yeah, it seems like a lot of the computational neuroscience around motor control in the present time is about motor cortex and building models of the dynamics of motor cortex, or like the recurrent connectivity that creates dynamics in motor cortex, focusing less on how motor cortex interacts with all the other areas that are trying to control the body via the spinal cord. I guess, traditionally the spinal cord stuff is like central pattern generators. And then the biophysics of muscles. But they all seem very, like, separate issues. People study very separately. Oh, yeah, and, like, kind of relating to a previous episode that we had about studying the brain in light of evolution, the idea of these different kind of shells of brain areas that all interact with the spinal cord and with movement control, it's kind of related to this idea of, like, evolutionarily you had, a much smaller nervous system and brain that was controlling movement, and then with evolution, like, more layers got added onto it that then control the layers that already existed, but also can control the spinal cord directly. And it's just like this, that's kind of how it comes to be this somewhat redundant seeming or very complex seeming system, because through evolution you add layers on top of the existing system that was already there, which makes kind of looking at the whole system in the end a little bit confusing, especially if you're not kind of thinking about that process that generated it. So that's kind of the gist of what I got from reading that brief anatomical review, was just that there's a lot going on in descending pathways. So now we can talk about understanding the hierarchy of motor control, which is obviously related to the fact that there are multiple descending pathways, and kind of how to make sense of how they all exist. So basically, this review is building off of the idea that advances in artificial intelligence are stimulating interest in neuroscience. That's the first line of the abstract. Normally, you see this more on the sensory side, I think, like the models of the visual system that are the same as models that are used to do computer vision, but you haven't seen a lot of that on the motor control side. So this review is adding that to the mix of the intersection between AI and neuroscience. So in the introduction to this review, they talk about John Hewlings Jackson, who was this like famous motor neuroscientist from the 1870s, and apparently he put forth this idea of the sensory motor machine consisting of a hierarchy of 3 evolutionary levels. So that's what I was talking about, like the evolution is building on what's already there. But I just thought that was impressive because that was in the 1870s, and that's like, evolution was just becoming a hot thing then. So I just thought that was interesting that it got applied so immediately. I guess similarly to how as soon as deep learning started getting good, it got applied to neuroscience. So fast turnaround. Right. But so yeah, like as we were talking about, it seems like currently this hierarchy idea that was there maybe in the early days of motor control studies isn't so much how things are talked about today. Like because people are just either focusing on a single area that they're trying to understand and not thinking about it in context of other things. So yeah, so I guess the point is that the motor system is a hierarchy and we'll be able to model it better if we understand it as that, which is not like the dominant framework right now.
Yeah, because I guess like a lot of the motor experiments that you do in neuroscience are relatively straightforward in some sense, I suppose, where you just have things like reaching tasks and this kind of stuff, or where you respond to certain stimuli.
Yeah, I guess we can talk about kind of what a standard motor experiment that at least like you hear about a lot in talks would look like. And usually I guess it's in non-human primates. And yeah, like the animal will have like a bar that it's holding in front of it, and its job will be to like move that bar to a particular location on like a table in front of it. And so it's very structured, and there's not any like uncertainty about what the animal should do. It knows exactly what it should do. It's not like the movement itself is the goal. It's not like a movement for a larger purpose, which is kind of what makes movement interesting, especially if you're going to be the type of person who says like the whole job of the brain is to produce motor output, and then you study like an animal moving its arm the same way over and over. Like, I don't think you're capturing the richness of what the whole point of the brain is.
To be devil's advocate, I mean, I think it's important also to have an experimental paradigm that's repeatable, in which you can kind of separate different kind of sources of variability in that, you know what I mean? Like, because the kind of data that I'm analyzing now is completely unconstrained. It has no behavioral task, and that's actually made it very difficult to interpret whether it's kind of variability in the activity itself or it's variability in the motor activity of the animal. So I think it's a complex problem that people have tried to simplify for good reason into these low-dimensional, very constrained tasks. And I think it's actually quite tricky to extend that to a more interesting question in a way that you can still analyze the data. I think that's the main problem.
Yeah, no, and this is, again, like reflected across all of neuroscience right now, I think. When you use kind of AI machine learning methods where you can actually get a model that can do something complicated, but then the thing we're studying in the brain isn't that complicated. It's like, well, what do? Do you make the behavior that we're studying in biology more real and complicated? Like, ideally, that's what we'd be studying all along, but there's a reason that people simplified it to begin with. There's a reason that people, like, made, instead of letting animals just explore and, like, recording all of their brain activity, they said, like, no, we're going to, like, hold them still and show them, like, something really simple or have them make a really simple movement. Like, yeah, that's kind of how science has to work in a way, to have a controlled experiment. But then I guess maybe the point is like I feel like even the people who did that initially didn't think like, oh yeah, and this is what we'll do forever. Like all of motor science will be simple arm movements.
Yeah, absolutely. And so the field should expand from that. But I think it's different from like in vision, for example, where people were looking at very simple gratings for a very long time, and then there's been a big trend towards like more natural image statistics, but you can just show the animal what you want it to see. You can't make a mouse produce like a specific type of behavior in the same way that you can just show it something. You know what I mean? Like you can't control the movement as well. And even if you do control the movement, you can make it produce some type of behavior. It's, you know, whether it's like actively engaged in that behavior or like how it's exactly performing that task could be different. So I think it's a much more subtle problem than sensory processing.
Yeah, it's just like a lot harder to control exactly what the animal is doing when they have to produce the output.
But I agree that that's the direction that we should be going.
Yeah, and I guess the hope is that there also are new tools that are being developed for basically analyzing this sort of more complex behavior as well, where, you know, part of the reason that these experiments were constrained as well is that we just wouldn't have known what to do with all of the data if we just let the animal run unconstrained. And so this is another thing that we hope is going to help as well, I guess.
Yeah. Hopefully it's time to move past those things, at least for some labs. Like you could always have some people who are still studying the isolated thing. Right. So in this review, they talk about the kind of current dominant framework for understanding behavior or understanding motor control in like a normative way, like what the brain should be doing to produce good motor outputs, is the optimal feedback control framework. So this is like simply it's just saying that there's some kind of cost function or objective that the animal is trying to do, and it should optimize its movements to do well according to that cost function or that objective. And particularly it can take into account sensory feedback when doing so. So that's where the feedback comes in optimal feedback control. But as we were saying, like people aren't focusing on the fact that things are a hierarchy, and this framework doesn't care about kind of the anatomy that implements that. It just says this is what the brain should be doing. And so in the context of how that can be studied, as we said, a lot of these tasks are like an animal moving a bar on a table or something. But you can, like while the animal is moving that bar, like push it, basically, like push its arm, apply some sort of force or counterforce or something to get it off the track that it was originally on. And you can see how the animal responds to that. And the idea in like an optimal feedback control framework would be that like it's not the case that if you are perturbed in some way in your movement that you need to go back to the plan that you were doing originally. Like it's not like if you're pushed off your path, you go back to like the exact path and then you carry on. You can, in light of having been pushed off your path, and you understand that you've been pushed off because you get sensory feedback, in light of that, you can now like make a new efficient plan from where you are. So that's kind of the idea, is that if you're being optimal, you can kind of adapt on the fly based on sensory feedback.
And so does optimal feedback control also include an internal model? Is that always the case, or is that sometimes the case?
So yeah, I think it's basically if you want to kind of plan on how to control, it's good to have some sort of internal model of like how your actions affect where you are. So that can either be an inverse model or a forward model. So a forward model is just like if you know where you are and you think about taking a certain action, you can predict where that will lead you. So it could be like, okay, if my arm is in this position and I'm going to apply like this direction to it, like where will it end up? Like if I'm going to make the muscles move in a certain way, where will my arm end up? So that would be like a forward model that you can use to predict the outcomes of your own planned actions. And then an inverse model is the ability to just kind of calculate if I want to end up in a certain goal state, how do I get there from where I am now? So these are like internal models that at like the computational level an agent could be using to try to plan its motor actions.
Yeah, I think it's not necessary for the OFC framework, but it could be very helpful. And I just wanted to mention we talked about the difference between these models also in the cerebellum episode, because that's classically in motor control. It's in the nervous system, has been hypothesized that the cerebellum implements either a forward model or an inverse model.
But I guess so an interesting question if you're trying to like kind of have a more broad real world mindset when you talk about optimal feedback control, you have to specify some objective that the animal is trying to optimize, but like what that objective is isn't clear. Because even in the situation where you've given the animal a simple task, that doesn't mean that like the whole motor system is optimized to perform that simple task. So if the animal has some kind of like behavior that isn't strictly optimal in that task, like there could be a reason for it that is based on the fact that it's, you know, it's trying to more broadly optimize things.
Yeah, I think this is a really good point. And I don't know, in a way, like the only objective function should be to like create more offspring if you're going to do, right? You know, like.
Yeah. Where are like the mating chauvinists that say the only part of the brain is to mate?
Yeah.
I guess the question here is how high level can you go in defining your objective function, right? If you're defining it to be like, oh, I want to reach out and grab this stimulus, or reach out and grab this thing, which I think is a useful thing to grab, and then when you're halfway there, then your perception sort of realizes that it's a different sort of stimulus. Then can OFC actually adapt for that kind of thing, or is it just not really equipped to do that?
My guess is this is where hierarchies come in.
Yeah, so I guess we'll come into that later, but yeah.
Yeah. But yeah, so yeah, there's the question of kind of what could we really say the objective is, and does it have to take into account like energy constraints or something like that? Then maybe, if you put those in, maybe it explains why animals have behavior that doesn't always look optimal or something like that. There could be all kinds of other constraints. And then there's also a question of just kind of like, is it really optimizing, or is it like approximating an optimization or something like that? Like, does it fail to do an optimal behavior because there's some other part of the cost function that we don't know about and it is being optimal in light of that? Or is it the case that it just can't be perfectly optimal even if it is optimizing a very simple cost function? So these are kind of the things that are hard to get at when you talk about the brain in terms of objective functions and that kind of thing, because it's not like you expect to explicitly find this information anywhere. It's like an implicit objective function, probably gotten through evolution and stuff. So how you can know that you've actually found it or you've found an approximation of it or anything like that is very complicated.
I think it's essentially not falsifiable, because you can always find like some objective function that it's going to be satisfying if you put enough constraints on it, or at least that's what I would assume. I don't know if that's mathematically true, actually. I don't know. I feel it's more of it's like a useful way to think about motor control, but it's like a framework more than a hypothesis.
Yeah.
But maybe like in very simple motor systems where there's really just reactions to simple stimuli.
Well, maybe at least in that like sponge that eats its brain.
Yeah,
we should be able to define a subjective function.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I guess if we're talking like about plain synthetic artificial systems, not talking about the brain, like basically how stuff is done today in motor control, they talk about implementing optimal feedback control using deep reinforcement learning, because in reinforcement learning you can like specify some objective function via rewards, and then you just like let the artificial agent control some outputs, and it has to learn how to control those outputs in light of like trying to get those rewards. So it can make this happen, especially if it gets feedback about the outcome of its own actions. So that's kind of like a natural connection between these things. But also in artificial systems, as in biology, sometimes people study like toy problems where you don't even need like a deep reinforcement learning system. You can just like solve the control problem directly if it's like really simple. But presumably those situations are not super relevant to understanding biology, I would imagine. Like the super simple control setups, the toy problems that you can solve directly.
Probably not, I guess, because from my understanding is they're just not robust enough to sort of noisy environments and
I like toy problems. Well, because I think, it helps us understand where they fail and when we need something more complicated.
Yeah, I guess knowing what complicated is depends on knowing what simple things can't do.
Yeah.
Right, and then so if you're trying to do maybe more complex things, if you're doing like reinforcement learning that has a model of the external world that you use to like predict the outcome of your actions, that's called model-based reinforcement learning. And so that's an option for planning in a more complicated world where you can't like solve something directly. But then obviously that requires that you have a model of the external world. So that's tricky as well.
So that goes back to the internal model.
Yeah. Yeah. So then that means that presumably in an organism, you'd have to learn that model through experience. But even that can be difficult because you don't have like full information about the world as you interact with it. So to produce like a good model of how the world works is still difficult, or how kind of the control of your own body even works is non-trivial.
But you do actually have a lot of sensory information. I mean, that's like what you have the most information about is how your movements affect your sensory input. You know, like that's the richest stream of information that an organism receives in a way, no?
Just because like you know the output signals and you know the input signals that you received.
Yeah, so because you know the motor commands that you produce and you receive some sensory information. So that's really like the richest source of information that you receive as an organism. And I think you could build a fuller model in the cerebellum.
Yeah, no, I mean, obviously, like we do come to have some understanding of our bodies and the world. So yeah, I think organisms are able to do this to some extent. But I think in the artificial setting, sometimes that is just like provided based on how the artificial agent is built. And that seems like a bit of a cheat if you don't have to learn the model.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah. To what extent that's hard-coded, I think, is also an interesting question.
Yeah, so an example of a case where like the deep reinforcement learning paradigm has worked recently is in playing Atari games. So this was like a big paper a few years ago where you could give a agent like pixel access, like access to the pixels that would appear on a video game screen, and then the output of the model was like the joysticks and buttons that you would use to play Atari, like if you should go up and press B or whatever. And so that was a case where, yeah, you get sensory information and you know your own outputs and you have to kind of put it all together to understand the objectives of the game and how to interact with the game in a way that will get you the most points and have you win the game and stuff like that. And so in a way, this is like covering a lot of the stuff that we're talking about in this context, but I think it's pretty clear that like the up, down, left, right of an Atari game is like not motor control. Like it's not what we would call motor control. But I guess I just want to understand kind of in that way, like what makes motor control different or special, that this situation that in some way has a lot of the relevant components like doesn't seem like an example of motor control at all.
Yeah, that's a good question, actually.
I think there's certainly part of it that's about the simplicity of the outputs. But if you're a very simple animal, your outputs might be like up, down, left, right.
Yeah, but I mean, there's also, I suppose, some sort of planning, the sort of direct, I mean, if you press up, then you know exactly what's going to happen in the, it's very linked. I think there's, some sort of goal and planning involved, which you need a sequence of actions to do, maybe. I'm not sure if that's...
Yeah, I think to play Atari, though, you probably need a sequence of actions in mind.
Yeah.
I think that is also related to presumably there are some simple organisms that don't really have much planning. I was thinking maybe like the kind of the time scales of the movements. Like in this Atari example, it's just like you do one thing or another thing or another thing, but like real world movements are continuous, but there's like discrete transformations between them, and like movement itself is kind of hierarchical in a way that you don't get in this like Atari setup, or maybe you do. I'm not sure. Are there like kind of hierarchies of sequences? I don't actually know much about Atari.
I think there are some games where you could say that there are hierarchies of sequences.
Yeah.
I think in the original paper, it didn't do well on the games that had long kind of time scale planning, where there was a Montezuma's Revenge is some game where you have to like get a key and bring it into another room and open a door, and that was like too complicated. But I'm sure like in general, RL systems could solve those kinds of games, but we still wouldn't call it motor control. Yeah. So I feel like it has to do with the fact that movements are continuous. That's a big one. It's like high dimensional. Like there's a lot of muscles in your body that you could be moving in a bunch of different ways. And the fact that you could kind of be doing multiple different things at the same time. Whereas in this case, it's like, at each time point, there's one choice that you're making amongst this very small set of discrete options.
And I was just going to say flexibility as well, which I think is related to the high dimensionality. You can kind of like learn different like low dimensional movements, but then change them throughout, and depending on your goals or something.
Yeah, there's more like interpolation between things. And then also there's the fact that, like, and this is kind of interesting as a difference between even when we use deep learning to study vision or other senses, the fact that movement is produced by a particular body. Like, we can show any animal the same picture and kind of record how its neurons respond to it. Like, we all live in the same visual space. But if you're going to build a model of motor control, like, you have to make a decision about the specifics of the body that's being controlled. And those specifics will impact kind of the scheme, presumably will impact the scheme that the agent learns about how to control its own body. Because if you're in a different body, then your kind of options for control are different, and what might make the most sense to achieve a certain task will be different. So there's like a weird individuality and specificity about motor control that doesn't exist if you're trying to study like sensory processing in quite the same way.
Well, there's also specificity and individuality in sensory processing, right? Like you have different retina types and different
in that
forms of
case,
sensors.
yeah.
But I guess you're saying it's because you're interacting with it, and sort of you're making actions with your body, is that really makes it more dependent on it, I guess, on the specificity.
Yeah, it feels like it would be more dependent on the specificity, and it feels like maybe it's like harder to model. Like, okay, yes, I can take an image and I can filter it in different ways to like replicate the visual system of different animals. Mm-hmm. Like, we know that mouse have very low resolution vision, so you make an image blurry and you remove most of the color, and it's like, okay, that's kind of how a mouse sees. So even that, if it's like the front end processing, you can kind of it's still pretty simple about how you extrapolate across different animals. Yeah. But if the whole output system, even like as you move up and up in the hierarchy, is kind of based on a particular low-level set of options, then that probably impacts a lot of things, or has the potential to impact a lot of things.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think it's also interesting to think about how, in terms of this idea of embodied like motor control, in terms of like how you incorporate like tool use or like prosthetics or something, or like when does something become a part of your body. I was going to say you can adapt to like loss of a limb or to gain of a prosthetic arm or something, but then I'm actually not. Can you do that in the visual system? I mean,
well, it's different. Like, getting a prosthetic limb would be like gaining something, or like using a tool is gaining something. So you can add new types of photoreceptors to animals during development, and they can figure out how to use them even if they're not native to that species. I saw some paper where I think they put human cones into mice, and then the mice had like more proper color vision or something like that. So I guess you can incorporate new sensors into your body, but it is different, obviously, than incorporating new effectors. But yeah, so I don't know how that looks over time in a developed system, how it incorporates like a new type of output. Obviously, we do that all the time because we do learn to use tools in a way that feels like pretty natural.
Yeah, exactly. I think limb loss is also, the number of like pigeons with only one foot that you see. Like, I think seriously, and they do, like, they live for, I don't know, it seems like they are doing fine. Like, that type of adaptability that seems to be necessary for the motor system that I think is probably not as common for sensory systems.
Yeah, and that's related to the idea that if you like lesion parts of the descending pathways, like the animal can just get over it somewhat quickly.
Yeah.
So that does align with the motor chauvinist position of like, this is so important, this is all that we're trying to do. So obviously you're going to be able to recover from any kind of injury because your whole point is to just keep producing motor output. Okay, so yeah, going back to a bit about the what like artificial systems can do now. So they talk about some examples of basically artificial systems that don't have a clear hierarchy built into their structure, still being able to do a decent amount of interesting motor control. So like simulated human bodies that can learn to traverse obstacle courses and that kind of thing through this deep reinforcement learning. And they're given the right sensory feedback. They're given like visual information and information about the body, its position and stuff. but it's not fed into the system in a hierarchical way, and the output of the system doesn't have any hierarchy involved in it, but they can still kind of learn to do some stuff. I think that example, so there was a video of this that was somewhat popular on Twitter for a little bit a few years ago. It's like a yellow skeleton body running through a simulated obstacle course, and its arms are going crazy. Like, it's running well and it's doing the obstacle course, but its arms like are flailing about in a very unnatural way. And I think that's kind of an example of not getting the objective function just right, presumably, because obviously humans like keep their arms down even when they're trying to run a lot. And that could be something about just broader objectives that need to be put in. It could be about energy constraints or something about the specifics of the body.
This is why I'm kind of not convinced about the objective function as the...
But it could also just be like the way the environment is simulated, right? Where you just...
What in the environment would prevent you from flailing? Because you might hit a tree or something? Like, because there's other stuff that you might...
Well, just the way that the muscles are set up.
Yeah, so in this kind of setting, like, the outputs might be the angles of the joints at any given point in time, or something just about the position that the body should take. And I think in some of the cases, I think it looks like the running humanoid is actually kind of maybe using the arms for momentum or other things. In ways that humans maybe could but don't, because they look weird.
Yeah.
Okay, and then the other thing about training these artificial systems, there's a mention of like a balanced curriculum is needed, and that maybe they don't always like generalize super well past what they were trained to do. And so that is kind of what leads us into the idea of hierarchies being useful for things like generalizing and also for learning efficiently. So let's get into these core principles of hierarchy in the motor system that the paper identifies. So the first one is information factorization. And so this means that different information is routed to different subsystems. So I guess we kind of talked about in the brain, like the subcortical and cortical areas, and this like idea of shells building over evolution. So you can get sensory information that goes into a specific region, or it could also go into another region, and in that way you can kind of divide up how information gets shared across different portions of the brain or of the system. And so you can like, it's kind of like a need to know basis kind of idea, is that like you don't need to give everybody all of the information, all of the sensory information that the body is receiving, because only certain parts of the system need that information directly. So it might be like maybe vision goes in early because maybe vision helps determine broader high-level goals, but proprioceptive feedback goes into an area that's more directly related to producing motor output, because you need that detailed information about the body when you're making detailed movements.
Yeah, this is kind of an interesting one, because I guess the idea is that then if you have this information factorization, then because essentially these systems would be invariant to the other types of information that other parts might be getting, then you can essentially have modules which are reusable across the system, because they're basically they're not going to be affected by information.
Yeah, no, that's really helpful to have, like, if you're seeing the same thing regardless of the position your body is in, maybe that's like, you don't need to know the position that your body is in when you're looking at something. Yeah. And so it's good that you can kind of get that data without the baggage of all the other context, if that context doesn't matter, because then you can learn more cleanly from it.
Yeah.
If, like, a particular part of the brain is ignoring the irrelevant bits that are also happening at the same time.
But I'd be curious to know whether this kind of thing can be, at what stage the constraint needs to be added in the design of the system. Basically, is it something that you really need a hard code at the beginning, or else the system can't learn at all, or is it something that actually the system will learn just to factorize out the information? I think my impression from the review is that you need to kind of impose it in some sense.
It would, I guess maybe it depends, like you'd have to have quite a clever learning algorithm maybe to have it learn to do that kind of thing. The second core principle is partial autonomy. So this means that lower level systems can function somewhat without input or modulation from higher level systems. So, like in the spine or something, you can have a central pattern generator that can create useful patterns even when not being explicitly told to do so or told how to change them or anything like that.
It seems like these and partial autonomy and information factorization and several other of these concepts are all very related, like theoretically different ideas, but kind of correlated. Sorry.
Yeah, so like to have partial autonomy, that means that the lower level system that's running on its own probably needs to get its own sensory input so that it would get like a version of the information that's relevant to it, and then the higher level control system would get a different version of information. So yeah, they're very related, these two in particular.
Do we agree that these two are just undeniably true?
Oh, well, I guess it depends on what you're talking about. If this is in the brain, yeah, I think so, yeah. If you're just talking about like good design of an artificial system, then I don't know what people think. It seems like they don't tend to create these kinds of hierarchies at the moment. So yeah, and then the idea would be that the higher level system would come in if something was going wrong. So like you let the lower level system just do what it wants, and then the higher level system comes in if something's gone wrong, kind of like with like management or mentoring. It's like you let the person do what they want until they screw up. In the motor control, the example would be like you're walking, and then when you trip, like then your cortex or something is like, whoa, time to pay attention, time to take the reins here. When I don't know about you guys, but whenever I fall, it does feel like it's like in slow motion, and I can feel my cortex being like trying to figure out what's happening and make the right choices. And my like actual consciousness feels like an observer of my cortex doing that.
Oh wow! No, I'm the opposite.
You don't feel that?
No.
What happens when you fall?
It happens really fast, and then I almost like I'm surprised that it happened afterwards. No, Jan, you're the tiebreaker. What do you feel?
Yeah,
I think I'm more along with Grace. I think, but this is interesting because that means that the seats of consciousness are different across humans. Yeah. You heard it here first.
I'm a freak. So I think this is also not just for in the case that it gets messed up, but also for transitioning or choosing which of these like lower level motor behaviors that are possibly pre-programmed into the spinal cord or something, kind of going between them.
Yeah.
Or coordinating them or something.
Yeah, and then the next core principle is amortized control. So that means that movements that have been successfully done in the past can be compressed into a system that can rapidly reproduce them. So like you don't have to actually plan what you're going to do every time. If you're doing an action that you've done many times, your brain will just like store that plan, and you can call it up when needed.
Yeah, I think this one's also undeniably true.
Well, that one may be less obvious to some people. I don't know, but yeah, I feel like it has to be.
Okay, maybe not undeniable. Probably true. Very likely. But
it's a good idea, certainly.
Yeah, like what? It just seems crazy that the nervous system would, like, in real time compute things. It has been having to redo it previously. I mean, I think I don't know.
And I guess this is also related to kind of like learning in the sense that the system has to be able to learn from a plan that it made. Some part of the brain or whatever made a plan, and now some other part is learning to memorize that plan and store it.
Yeah.
There's also a bunch, I mean, in sort of more neuroscience theory research, there's like, I think with like recurrent networks, the idea that, you know, if you leverage the sort of sequences that naturally arise in recurrent networks, then you can sort of learn how to generate outputs a lot more efficiently.
Yeah, there's kind of... Yeah, well, so you're talking about like echo state where like you keep the recurrent network with random weights and then just learn to read it out differently. Yeah, I guess you'd be learning the different readouts that you want to make from it.
So I wonder whether
that almost seems like the inverse to me, where the learning is kind of, I don't know, you're taking advantage of like the natural dynamics of the network, rather
that's
than.
That's kind of how I understand this, but maybe
Well, I think this one is saying like it's not that you like basically this is maybe saying that you could learn the recurrent weights as well. Like if there's a particular pattern you're always generating, then you should specialize that circuit to produce that pattern and maybe a few others, and then you can call them up whenever you need. The next core principle is modular objectives, which means that each subsystem can be trained to optimize specific objectives. And so that means that basically the system doesn't have to be trained end to end, which is common in like machine learning setups where you just define an architecture and then train the whole thing all in the same objective function. But if you have a hierarchy and different subsystems and all of that, they could each be trained in their own way and then just kind of put together intelligently.
I think this one is undeniably false, but useful to. I'm being a little bit ridiculous because I'm trying to get a rise out of Josh, but it's not working.
He's smirking.
But I mean, it's useful to think about like different modules in the brain having different objectives, but it just seems like, of course, there isn't an objective function for like every different area of the brain. That's just a useful way of thinking about it. And of course, the only objective function is mating, and I'm now a mating chauvinist.
You're gonna have to change your research plan. I mean, yes, this I think just goes back to your original objections to the concept of objectives.
Yeah.
Yeah. But if we can say anything about objectives, then maybe we can say that certain areas have different sub-objectives that aid in the overall objective. So an example is sensory prediction. Like, you have sensory inputs and you know your action in the world, and so can you, as like a sub-goal for part of the system, can it learn to predict the next sensory state based on the current one in an action? And that, like, being able to do that could be very useful, like in terms of having a model of how the environment works and that kind of thing. But it is technically a sub-goal that can kind of be trained independent of the larger goal.
Yeah, I would sort of go against Alex's statement there, because I would say like that this is the only way that I can see it where like thinking about objectives kind of makes sense, really. Having an objective that is, for the entire motor system seems, it's like how would you do that essentially? But when you think about it sort of in this modular sense, then it seems a bit more feasible.
No, I mean, I think it seems more feasible definitely in the terms of artificial intelligence or theoretical neuroscience. But it just seems to me, like biologically, an objective function doesn't exist. There is no objective function. Or you can like write down an objective function, but maybe it's very contextual and it depends, or maybe it doesn't respect the anatomical boundaries that you drew. And so like there's actually several objective functions for some region that you're interested in, or there's like one overlapping objective functions in different. It's useful to think about and to create hypotheses, but I think it's not real. No?
Yeah, I understand what you mean when it's not real. It's not like we're ever going to like physically find it. It is implied by the way the system acts and learns and that kind of thing. So the next core principle is multi-joint coordination. So that's to say, essentially, that the body doesn't necessarily have to use all of its independent degrees of freedom independently. There can be like joints and muscles that work together to produce like a coordinated action that needs to be coordinated across all of them. And then that can kind of help with the dimensionality of the problem, especially when you're exploring, like if you're exploring how to use your hands in a new environment, like you wouldn't just move all of your fingers independently. Like if you're learning to play a musical instrument, you wouldn't just like randomly move your fingers. Like you have some subset of movements that seem natural that involve coordination across the different muscles or joints.
Yeah. But the music example is interesting because often in music you have to break your motor synergies, right? Like when you're playing the piano, you have to move your middle and your ring finger in like ways that you don't usually move them, and that makes
maybe
it
musical
difficult.
Instruments aren't a good example of this.
No, but it is a good.
Require unnatural.
No, it's a good example of like how the motor synergies can evolve and how you can learn new synergies possibly. I like this idea.
And the last core principle is temporal abstraction. So that's the idea that temporal motifs that are used a lot get abstracted. Basically, like if you have a hierarchy and there's a higher level system, it can plan on a coarser time scale. So that's the abstraction bit, because it can send a coarse signal to a lower level system that will produce like low level fine grained dynamics based on that signal. And the benefit of that is that then the higher level system can, because it's planning on a coarser time scale, it can plan on a longer horizon as well. So it's like while you're walking, you can think about the directions you're taking and where you're going to turn next, because your body, like the lower level part of your body, is producing the fine-grained movements you need to be walking. So that's the benefit of having this abstraction. Alex, how do you feel about the the plausibility of this?
I think, yeah, I mean, this seems probably true. So it's just, okay, so the idea is just that the kind of upstream or higher areas are sending information on a different temporal resolution than that is actually used for the generation of behaviors, which would be like lower level. Is that?
Yeah, it's like there's like a pyramid where the higher level is sending like a core signal that gets like spread out over time by the lower level ones, and so that it has fine-grained control over the right.
I wasn't exactly sure what this. Does this mean like it would be like do this, now do this, now do this? You know, like kind of action selection, and then the lower level has actual dynamics of the movement, or does it mean that it's like kind of continuously saying like do this? Are you doing this? Yes, you're okay. Are you doing this now? You know what I mean? Like, is it? It's kind of a little fuzzy from abstract. I don't know.
Well, I think the cartoon version is that there's like a signal at the top layer that's on for like a minute, and it leads to dynamics in the lower level that are complex over that minute. And then like another signal turns on the top level, and that's on for like a minute, and that leads to different dynamics at the lower level. That would be like the cartoon version. Obviously, it's more complicated than that, and the timescales of the higher level will depend on the actual task, and there might be feedback if the lower level is screwing up. The higher level will have to get involved more directly or something like that.
So it is. Yeah. So it is kind of related to this action selection idea, or like.
Yeah. I mean, I guess. Yeah. So we like in neuroscience, there's kind of a sense of action selection as like a discrete like. I'm going to choose to do this action, and then the action itself obviously has temporal dynamics.
Yeah.
And then you choose a different action.
Exactly.
But you could imagine kind of the continuous version of that at all levels.
Yeah. I think that's probably true. I'm just afraid of saying undeniably true again.
Right. So now we can talk about, with these core principles in mind, we can just kind of maybe be a little bit more specific about how they show up in the brain. Because the next section of the review goes from kind of low-level areas in the brain up to high-level ones and demonstrates some of these at play. And a lot of this is through lesion studies that people have learned kind of the role of different areas. Though, as we said, those can be complex because there's a lot of plasticity. But I guess I want to talk about the figure in box 2, which is... basically like a bunch of different brain areas kind of described in terms of their role in this hierarchy with only the lightest outline of a brain shape around them. It's a very computational view of a brain.
Yeah.
Yeah. But so the interesting thing, and this isn't necessarily new to this review, but the kind of, I don't know, from a modern neuroscience perspective, the perhaps surprising bit is the idea that the hypothalamus could be at the top of the motor hierarchy. Basically, the hypothalamus is involved in a lot of base drives like eating and drinking and sleeping and fighting and mating. And so, like, there are kind of known nuclei that you can stimulate there that produce those kinds of behaviors. So it seems like the hypothalamus is involved in the regulation of these different motivations. And so, I mean, in a way, then it makes sense that it would be at the top of the motor hierarchy because that's what the motor system is for. That's what the brain is for, is to produce, it's not just to produce any motor output, it's to produce motor output that satisfies certain needs for the organism. But it's just such like a not sexy area in modern neuroscience, partly just because it was well studied in like the 70s and stuff. I think like people got a sense of it. But yeah, so according to just certain views of the motor system, the hypothalamus is the pinnacle.
I think the motor chauvinists would probably like that at the top of the hierarchy because it sort of speaks to the sort of primacy of it in some way. But I'm not so sure actually.
No, I like it as a yeah.
Okay.
Well, you're a mating chauvinist now, so that makes sense.
Well, so you obviously mating chauvinist, like,
yeah.
Like hypothalamus, yeah.
But it makes sense that like a lot of your actions are dictated by those type of primal. I mean, most of my actions are dictated by hunger. I don't know.
Yeah.
Yeah,
that's why you've become like a professor out of hunger.
Yeah.
You know, it is in France, so it's nice food.
Okay, and then so the hypothalamus can provide context to other areas to guide the selection of motor behaviors. So it can provide input to the basal ganglia and the thalamus, which are, especially the basal ganglia, I guess, are usually considered like action selection regions. of the brain, which can then send their kind of commands onto the brainstem and the spine about what to do in light of the motivation that comes from the hypothalamus. And then those lower level areas can interact with the sensory lower level areas. So like the brainstem and other subcortical sensory areas can help with the action selection based on like what's currently happening. And then kind of on top of that, you have the cortex, which like wraps all of these things and provides another layer of all of them. So the motor cortex can give inputs to the basal ganglia to modulate it as it's trying to kind of act on the desires of the hypothalamus.
Can I draw attention to, not to just be the cerebellum person all the time, but to this vague cerebellar cortical connections that don't seem to be connected to any region in the back of the brain? Like, what is this?
I think the way that they're drawn, they're connected to everything.
But like, you just need to have the cerebellum going back to the thalamus, because it connects the motor cortex through the thalamus, and then the motor cortex connects to the cerebellum through the pons, which is already there. So it's like, it's almost, too bad it's not like the first author had a friend who was a cerebellar expert they could ask, who was very interested in cerebellar cortical connections, which formed the basis of her faculty research program.
All right, so getting into kind of the lesion type studies that help us understand some of these things. So basically, if you just look at a spinal cord, it can do still some pretty interesting things. I guess this is kind of almost the opposite of a lesion study, because rather than like taking a part away and studying the rest of the brain, you're basically just taking a part and studying it. You just take the spinal cord and look at it. But yeah, so it can generate like fictive locomotion if you provide it with inputs, and it can generate the right kind of outputs that would control the body in the way that it could do kind of like basic behaviors like we were talking about with central pattern generators. Yeah, and it's responsive to sensory feedback, which is relevant if it's going to have optimal control. If you leave like bits of the brainstem involved, then you can create somewhat more complex motor behavior in animals if you stimulate different nuclei. So it might not produce complex behavior on its own, but because it would produce it in light of like getting the right kind of input from a higher area, if you provide that input through electrical stimulation, then you can get kind of like behavior that is more coordinated across multiple joints that looks a bit more complex, even from just having like pretty low level, like not cortex and not some of the other regions of the brain. Like it's simulating input from the basal ganglia or from the cerebellum if you stimulate these low level nuclei. And then if you just remove the cortex, so you still then have everything but the cortex left, so that would be including like the basal ganglia and the thalamus and other things, then you get like behavior that is like alarmingly not weird looking, I think.
Yeah, it's pretty crazy.
So you can remove the whole cortex, and an animal will still like walk around and kind of just do like, it's almost like if you have like a video game version of an animal, I feel like, because they talk about how like it'll walk into corners and it won't know how to get out, so it'll just like keep walking or just like kind of do random movements. So it's like you have a pre-programmed set of the type of movements that an animal does, and it just kind of like does them in some combination that isn't super intelligently related to its surroundings, but it still like captures the statistics of an animal.
Yeah, that's pretty good evidence for why in this diagram in box 2, the sort of cortex has got not a very central role. It's just, the part that feeds back information about the environment, essentially.
Yeah, and maybe can like correct when things go wrong.
Yeah, but these are all very kind of simple movements as well.
Sure.
Well, decorticate male rodents can still copulate and produce young. So for a mating-based view of the brain, you don't even need the cortex. I guess that's when they're kind of handed a mate, though, maybe to acquire a mate. Exactly. But also, so when you remove the cortex, you get this kind of behavior that seems like they're not responding appropriately to the sensory environment, but over time they can learn to respond appropriately. So it seems like the lower level systems are capable of doing things that when the cortex is present, we ascribe to the role of the cortex. But that's kind of interesting to me because it suggests almost like some kind of meta learning. Like in the absence of cortical input, it can learn to learn a thing that it didn't normally care about, is what it seems like. So it has some sort of learning rule that like works both in light of cortical input, and that'll make it ignore certain things. But without the cortical input, it can learn to process that information and use it appropriately. So that seems pretty powerful, but I guess it's kind of related to the evolutionary idea that like in some animals, this is all that they have. So of course it needs to be like know how to be responsive to the sensory environment.
Yeah, it's fascinating actually. A lot of stuff you can do without a cortex.
Why don't you even need one? All it does is make us unhappy.
Okay, so I guess getting into what the cortex is needed for. So it does seem like this might be an area, again, related to the evolutionary idea, that has species differences. So when you remove the cortex, even just the motor cortex of primates, you can get more substantial behavioral deficits. And even after they're able to learn and kind of recover from them, they still remain deficient when it comes to like fine-grained motor control, so the movement of the fingers and that kind of thing. So this points to the idea that the cortex has developed for the types of, actually kind of some of the types of the behaviors that we consider like what makes humans and primates good at things is to have like opposable thumbs and fingers that you can control, and so that you can create tools and manipulate them and all of that kind of thing.
So does the learning occur, it learns to do a dexterous movement with a cortex, and the cortex is removed, and then the dexterous movement can't be performed, or it can't learn the dexterous movements without?
So in the case of like fine motor control of your fingers, it seems like even after recovery, you like can't even control them finely. So that's not about learning. So they say like after strokes, people can recover a lot of motor control, but they still can't recover fine motor skills. But then there's another study in rodents where they learn to do this like complex motor behavior that isn't necessarily about fine motor control, but they learn to do it while they have a cortex, and when you remove the cortex, they can still do it, but they couldn't learn it without a cortex. Yeah, so the actual execution of fine motor skills requires the cortex, but learning of certain types of complex movements requires cortex that, in a way that the movements can be executed without it. So in primates, there's like a direct projection from cortex to the spinal neurons that control distal limbs, I believe. And so that's clearly an example of like the cortex wanting to control that at that level. Whereas I guess you can like rely on the lower level systems to do a lot more of the like broader movement, like posture and walking and that kind of thing. And then also they talk about the need of cortex for like hand-eye coordination. If you want a good integration of different sensory inputs, then cortex can help with that. Like, as we said, subcortical areas get this kind of sensory information, but maybe they get it in like a more coarse way, or they don't have like the capacity to process it in the way that really makes you have good hand-eye coordination.
Or it could be the type of adaptation that you're learning as well. Like really like kind of dumb associative, like hand-eye associations we could possibly learn with like subcortical structures.
But if you're not getting fine enough sensory input, then even if it's like simple associative stuff, it's not like the learning that is the constraint, it's just the actual fidelity of the sensory input, from what I understand.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then in addition to just lesioning, there's also a study where they used a virtual environment where you could dissociate the like sensory feedback loop, because you can control the sensory feedback based on what the animal does. And they can observe in the activity of motor cortex the production of corrective responses when the sensory environment doesn't change in the expected way, because that would like signal to the cortex that something different is happening and it needs to like take control and fix the motor plan. And yeah, I like the idea of the cortex like tutoring the subcortex. Like it's coming up with plans on the fly because it has some ability to like produce a plan based on current sensory information, and then it kind of trains the subcortex to do maybe some simpler version of that or a more reflexive version of that if it seems like a motor plan that's going to be used repeatedly.
Mm.
And then I guess going back to this problem of studying only very simple and stereotyped behaviors in the lab. So sometimes people will study preparatory activity in motor cortex, and so that's when like you let the animal know the movement it has to make, but you don't let it actually make the movement, and you can kind of see certain dynamics in motor cortex that look like this is like its plan, like it's producing the plan of how it needs to move. But like to really kind of think of that as an interesting production of a plan, you would maybe assume that that has to be a movement that the animal hasn't done a million times, because if it's done it a million times, it's probably just sending a signal to subcortex that says, hey, do that thing you've done a million times. So the actual production of a plan in an interesting sense probably would need to be studied in a case where, the animal isn't overtrained on the task that it's doing. If we really want to get at like how cortex can on the fly come up with a motor plan.
So motor preparation isn't only linked to planning. I mean, it's also related to this idea of like setting the system in a good initial state to execute that movement. Thinking to like classic paper by like Chinoy, Sahani, like Mark Churchland, right?
I think it's talked about in different ways by different people, maybe, or just.
I mean, I think it's a little different from planning, and I do think it's actually. I don't think it's idiosyncratic. I think it's very relevant in examples in which you have to make a movement that's very quick but requires a lot of accuracy. So, for example, like you have to jump over like a big like trench or something. Happens all the time. Or when you like have to make a like playing golf or something.
So I think those are very different examples, though, because usually when you're playing golf, you are trying to, at least when you're like teeing off or something, you're trying to replicate the same motion over and over. So that is something that hopefully would at some point become like more automatic. If you're jumping over a trench, you probably haven't jumped over that trench before, and you're taking into consideration a bunch of the like specifics of that environment and everything as you're making that plan. So I feel like that situation would look interesting in motor cortex, because motor cortex is needed for that situation more.
I don't think that's necessarily true. If you think about the natural environment in which a mouse would live, it's very likely that there would be like some, like areas where they would have to jump over like a river or something, or or the stream, or I don't know, a gutter or something in a more urban environment. And if that is within its the natural environment within which it lives, it may very well have made that jump many times in order to.
But then cortex might not be needed. It's not that it can't do it, or that it's like you wouldn't see the signal of that somewhere, but it might not be in cortex.
I don't know if it's in cortex, but there's a lot of evidence of preparatory movements in cortex. But.
I think the example of like the golf swing or whatever is interesting, for maybe it's for the same reason, I'm not sure. Like where if you watch like sports players, basically whenever they're preparing for making a movement in which they have practiced a lot. So in rugby, or probably in American football, if you're going for a kick, often you see that like the players do the same. They have this like behavioral tick that they do beforehand, and apparently sports psychologists encourage them to do that because that gets them into like the zone or something. And I wonder if that's related to getting into this initial state, preparatory state, which they see in those experiments.
I wonder if we remove the cortex of football players, if they could still do a really good kick.
We'll see.
that movement that you're talking about isn't like an overt practicing of the movement, right? It's like some other, well, at least in the rugby
example. It's like superstition is what it looks like.
I mean, it looks superstitious, but it works really well.
No, I'm sure, yeah. I mean, maybe it's just about extending the movement, because all that really matters is like the moment your foot hits the ball or something, but to have a longer practiced movement, just like make sure that you get to that point at the right time.
Weirdly enough, a lot of the times the movement isn't connected to the actual to the leg movement. Like they do something with their face.
Exactly.
They go like this, and they just like, it's almost like visualizing. So it's obviously weirdly, there's probably many psychological things involved. It's not just preparatory stuff, but yeah.
So let's kind of just talk about the future directions section. So there's a bit about basically in both artificial and biological systems the need for full scale body control. So just kind of scaling up the understanding of motor control, and we study it or how we build it. And basically, there are two ways. If you're building an artificial system to do motor control, there are two ways that you can make it. One is task-driven, which is like more like what we were talking about. Like you use reinforcement learning to have an animal learn how to traverse an obstacle course or something like that, and then you can see like how motor control can work with different architectures. The other way is to be data-driven, so that would be like actually capturing data of how humans or animals move and training a model that replicates it. So that's like usually motion capture data and like training directly on it. Which I guess to me, the task-driven way makes a little bit more sense if you really want to understand. I guess it feels more natural because it's more a replication of what humans are doing. Like they're trying to accomplish things. They're not just trying to like mimic superficially movements. But those are just kind of two ways to build artificial systems. And then another area that they're highlighting is to study the structure of interregion communication. And I feel like that's like true across neuroscience. We need to be studying how regions communicate more. And in the context of the motor hierarchy, it's like through what language do they send a signal? Like how does a higher area talk to a lower area? Is it like some very coarse-grained thing, or does it give it very precise instructions? And kind of how can it learn to, I guess, both do its own task and also communicate efficiently with the areas it needs to communicate with. And then there is the question of motor learning and imitation. So it is the case that humans do like learn from other humans. They can look at what other humans are doing and try to replicate it, especially like young children obviously do this a lot. But I guess in the artificial setting, imitation learning is done via teleoperation is the word. So it's like, it's not the case that the agent is looking at another agent and trying to mimic it. It's more like it's kind of like if you're learning to play golf and someone like puts their arms around your arms and it's like an exoskeleton around you and like controls your body rather than you looking at what they're doing and trying to mimic it. So it doesn't seem like clearly we can look at people and mimic them. So the question is like, if you're looking at someone again that has like a very different body than you, obviously no one has like super different bodies. Like it's not like you look at like a rodent and try to like mimic what it's doing necessarily. But if you're looking at another human that still does have some differences in their body, like how do you look at that and translate it into coordinates that make sense for you when you're trying to control your body? That's like obviously a non-trivial problem. So those were kind of the future directions. Is it time to bring Josh in? Anyone have any other things they want to say without him retaliating?
I want to say that I liked this review, even though I complained a lot, mostly to annoy Josh. But I think it was really interesting, actually.
Yeah, I think that so Grace, when you asked the question of like what is different from motor learning if it's not the up and down actions in the Atari game, I think this review kind of gives pretty solid sort of answers to that. It's which I think is useful. I liked it.
We're just buttering him up before he starts.
Mm-hmm.
No, I'm not sure I have much to say, and I'm not sure I should say too much. I think overall you guys covered it quite well. I suppose there were only a few points where perhaps certain areas where you didn't know so much about it and maybe you speculated a little bit, and that would be the things that I would
go on
attempt to correct. I mean, I think overall though you sort of reasoned through most of it.
I actually have a question.
Sure.
On the information factorization thing.
Yeah.
How strictly do you have to impose that?
Yeah, I mean, maybe in some places you guys were presuming there was like more of a definitive stance.
Sure.
I think some places I was being abstract because there's like some cluster of ideas that have started to emerge in the area, but then like people are still trying to figure it out, right? So the AI side of the story is not resolved.
Right.
And so in the context of like information factorization specifically, different people have tried to use this in different ways. So give different amounts of information to the high level or low level controllers. And I mean, mostly in very narrow problem domains, it makes sense that you could know in advance what that factorization should be. But that's not, I mean, the naive intuition perhaps would be that, and this is true for a lot of model-free based approaches, is that it takes a lot of experience if you don't start it with some architectural prior that's going to make it do approximately the right thing. Yeah, one other thing that came up in the context of modular objectives that I think is interesting. I mean, the modular objectives one is a little bit overloaded in some sense. There's many different ways that could be implemented. I think I agree with what Alex was saying, that of course there's no like objective functions per se in the nervous system, but I take that as kind of an obvious point in some sense. It's like we're always looking at these physical systems and trying to interpret them in the context of what they seem to be doing. And so I think Grace's example to counter this was if you have some sort of sensory prediction kind of subsystem where the role of a system is to learn from sensory predictions to anticipate sensory consequences of actions or something like this. Like that would be an example of an objective that isn't related directly to producing movement, so it's a different objective from producing movement. But another example that at least comes up in the AI side, and depending on the view in biology, people have talked about it, but I don't think that there's sort of a clear take on it in the context of biology, would be a hierarchy of goals. So one subtle point about the modular objectives is one version of it, which is related to an idea originally called feudal networks, feudal learning, basically, is that a high-level system will communicate a goal to a low-level system, and that serves as instruction, but it also serves as the objective for the low-level system. So, like, if you have a high-level system and a low-level system that are both trying to learn, if the high-level system tells the low-level system what to do, and the low-level system does something which is not great from the perspective of the overall objective, like the high-level system says go right, and the low-level system goes approximately right, the low-level system should be rewarded for that because it's learning from the goal set by the high-level system. Whereas if the low-level system goes left when the high-level one says go right, the low-level one should learn from that. That's kind of irrelevant whether the high-level system is giving good instructions for the overall behavior or not. And so you could have a high-level system that would learn from a different objective than the low-level one's learning from. The low-level one's learning from, am I doing the right thing that the high-level one told me? And the high-level one is saying, did I learn to do the task correctly or something like this? Or did I satisfy my motivation, which might be go find the food or whatever? Certainly on the neuroscience side of it, I think you guys covered it nicely. Maybe one other thing at the beginning that came up was the idea of how different is like control of an Atari-style controller from a body, and I think you ultimately resolved it and got at most of it. I mean, sort of in the simplest sense, the main thing I would say is that Atari is like one of k primitive actions where k is a small number, right? It's like each time step you press one of k buttons, essentially. Whereas motor control is at each time step, whatever that means, for whatever the sort of smallest temporal increment is that you're dealing with, you're commanding a vector output where you have to choose a bunch of continuous values. So like if we wanted to if we're thinking about the formalism, that's kind of the simplest case. It's each time step, rather than selecting one of k, buttons to press, I have to tell all of my muscles what to do. And those are not just like on or off, but it's like I have to give a graded signal to all of my muscles. Yeah, other than that, I think I'm pretty content with how you guys presented it.
Okay. I think then we passed. We passed this test. We did all right. Okay. Till next time. Hey, if you're still listening to this, you must really like us. So how about you go to iTunes or Stitcher and rate the podcast, give us some feedback. You can also go to our website, unsupervisedthinkingpodcast.blogspot.com. You can comment on different episodes, or you could give us ideas for new topics you want to hear about. We would love to hear from you. Thanks.